So, hello everyone, and a warm welcome to the launch of the Cambridge Companion to Women Composers, edited by Matthew Head and Susan Wallenberg. It's a joy to host this event in association with the Women in Global Music Network, and as part of the International Symposium, Dame Ethel Smyth, Connections, Culture, and Context, hosted by Hannah Millington and Amy Ziegler at Dublin City University this weekend. I introduced this event not only as a contributor to the volume, but also as a friend who has followed the book since its earliest stages, when Susan and I were colleagues at Lady Margaret Hall, University of Oxford. It's wonderful to celebrate this landmark publication here today with friends and colleagues from around the globe. And it seems entirely fitting to do so against the backdrop of the Smyth Symposium. We've heard about Smyth as trailblazer, as radical feminist composer, as social advocate, as audacious, as role model, and perhaps the leitmotif of the weekend, Smyth as rebel. And it seems equally fitting to mention Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, a powerful reimagining of literary history that we may think about in relation to the book we're launching today. To have a Cambridge Companion to Women Composers is to change the narratives of music history, how we teach, the repertoire we perform, and the stories we tell across music and sound art, broadly defined. It is, as the editors put it, quote, to reveal scenes of flourishing creativity, technical innovation, and often fleeting recognition, challenging long-held notions around invisibility and neglect, and dismissing cliches about women composers and their work, end quote. Yet just as this companion represents the first of its kind, so it also confronts cycles of erasure, avoiding what the editors call, quote, the amnesia, whereby each generation feels they are rediscovering women composers for the first time, end quote. Rather, there is a sense of joining a conversation, which continues today, as the individual chapters build on earlier phases of feminist music studies and initiate new avenues of inquiry. And in this regard, we have an opportunity not only to celebrate the book, but also the work of the editors in making this possible, and for their pioneering scholarship over many decades, notably Matthew Head's monograph, Sovereign Feminine, Music and Gender in 18th Century Germany. And in Susan Wallenberg's case, from being the first woman appointed to a university lectureship in music at the University of Oxford, to bringing women in music into a more central place in the discipline through numerous articles, book chapters, special journal issues, and edited volumes. I'll now hand over to Susan and return later to introduce our guest speakers, Cornelia Bartsch and Larry Todd. Thank you and enjoy the event.
Thank you, Joe. And I begin with some thanks to various people. First to Matthew, my co-editor, for his share of the planning, editing and writing that went into the book, and to all our chapter authors for their work and for their devotion to the subject. They're thanked more fully, as are various others, in the book's acknowledgements. They include the three contemporary composers, Nicola Lefanu, Roxana Panofnik, and Shirley J. Thompson, who generously gave time to contribute to the epilogue entitled Composers' Voices. Since she first approached me with the idea of a companion to women composers, Kate Brett at Cambridge University Press has been a staunch supporter of the project at every stage. Before introducing my choice of reading from the book, special thanks go to Joe Davies and Hannah Millington, who are, as you may have gathered, the powerhouse behind today's event, and to our two very special guest speakers, Cornelia Bartsch and Larry Todd, for their part in it. And warm thanks to all of you who've joined us at this event for your support of it. I've chosen some passages to read in slightly abridged form from Chapter 8 of the Companion, Women and Composition, circa 1600 to 1750, so approximately halfway through the book's main contents. I begin at the beginning of the chapter, which encapsulates something of the ethos we'd envisaged for the volume as a whole. So, Chapter 8, author Rebecca Cypes, paragraphs 1 to 5. Among women composers circa 1600 to 1750, a handful of names are well known today. Among these are Francesca Caccini, Barbara Strozzi, and Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, all of whom composed a large quantity of music, published substantial books of their compositions, and were recognized by authoritative, most often male, musicians, critics, and listeners. Their music appears in concert programs and recordings, and they may be understood to form part of a canon of women composers from the Baroque era. Recognition of these prominent women is surely a triumph of feminist musicology and performance in the past 40 years. Yet, the attention paid to these prominent women has yielded a misunderstanding of women's compositional practice during the period, namely that only a handful of women engaged in composition. This myth was first established by writers such as Piton du Tillet, who lauded Jacquet de la Guerre, writing, "Never has a person of her sex had such great talent for the composition of music and for the admirable manner in which she played on the harpsichord and organ." In Titon's account, Jacquet appears as the exception, proving the rule that women did not compose. Throughout the early modern period, professional skills in composition were unavailable to most women. Many church schools with robust music programs did not accept girls. Moreover, social norms that constrained women's authorship contributed to a high degree of self-consciousness and apprehension around musical composition. Nevertheless, new opportunities for women's careers as performers emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries with the rise of professional ensembles at aristocratic courts and the emergence of opera and other genres depending on women's skill in performance. More women began training as apprentices in music, appearing in performance, teaching music, studying instruments, realizing figured bass, improvising, and being paid for their work. Many of these performers engaged in composition, even if they never published their work, and little of it survives. While there was a clear distinction between the role of performer and professional composer at that time, professional employment and financial success as a composer were not the only motivators for composing. Amateur women, too, sought out musical training and practiced musicking in a variety of forms, playing, singing, acting as patrons, collecting scores, hosting private concerts, and composing music, whether for private use or public consumption. Whether they were professionally trained or not, and whether or not their music circulated in print, many women engaged in composition as a means of being creative and expressive. Women composed for a wide range of reasons, drawing on an array of systems of education and networks of support. While much evidence of women's composition has not survived, documentation of some 150 women across Europe and in the New World who engaged in composition between 1600 and 1750 allows us to conceive of a more inclusive history. Consideration of these broader circumstances sheds new light on canonic women composers. While Strozzi, Caccini, and Jacques de la Guerre were indeed exceptionally prolific, their engagement in composition was facilitated by environment within which women's creative authorship in music was accepted and valued. Recognition of the environment that encouraged their compositional practices bears important implications for the understanding of women composers throughout history. And now I'll finish with an example from a paragraph later in the chapter of one of those 150 women. So, Rebecca writes, the family of Leonora Duarte was of Jewish origin. They had converted and migrated from Portugal to Antwerp to escape the Inquisition. They assembled a dazzling collection of art and corresponded with intellectuals from across Europe. Music making formed an important part of the family's sociability and business enterprises. Duarte's compositions for viols are the only surviving viol pieces by a woman from the 17th century. Yet few of the sources that discuss music making in the Duarte home mention Leonora's compositional activities, focusing instead on performance in her home. If the score of her symphonias for viol consort had not survived, it would be difficult to trace her activities as a composer. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Susan. I'm pleased now to introduce Cornelia Bartsch, who is internationally renowned for her work on music and gender and post-colonial studies. Bartsch has held teaching posts, research positions, and guest professorships in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. She is currently guest professor for musicology and diversity studies at the Technical University of Dortmund and visiting professor at the University of Music and Theatre in Hamburg. She has published widely on gendered narratives in European music of the long 19th century, on Fanny Hensel, on Ethel Smyth's songs, her queer aesthetic, and her politics in music. Among her publications are the volumes Border Crossings, Gender, Ethnicity, and Class as Knowledge Categories in Musicology, published in 2016, Rock Blaster, Bridge Builder, Road Paver, The Composer Ethel Smyth, 2010, and The Male and the Female Beethoven, 2003. After seeing you in person this weekend, Cornelia, it's a joy now to welcome you to the launch of the Cambridge Companion to Women Composers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this nice introduction and also for the honor to speak here. What I think, what is outstanding regarding this book is the combination of a structural perspective on how women composers have been made invisible during history, and at the same time naming and recognizing them and their work, as well as the work of many musicologists who did so during the last decades. Analyzing, for instance, and Susan's reading of parts of chapter 8 were one very good example. In analyzing, for instance, what the term composer was meant to be, what public meant during a specific time, and how it emerged, and how, on the other hand, the female or woman were excluded from exactly these concepts which emerged to a certain time. And this combination of a structural perspective and also this very perspective to really recognize and show and make the work visible and audible specifically, corresponds to what you, the editors Susan Wallenberg and Matthew Hart, claim in their prologue. I quote, "The work is feminist because it is not content to add women into existing historical plots, but challenges those narratives on the basis of female achievements." And I go on quoting a little bit further. It is to discover the history of women and art is in part to account for the way art history is written, to expose its underlying values, its assumptions, its silences, and its prejudices, is also to understand that the way women artists are recorded is crucial to the definition of art and artists in our society. And now I would like to just give some examples on how I think this is really outstanding, how you built this books. I'm sorry that I cannot name all the chapters, but I would just like to give some insight on some of the chapters. What the first chapter of Paula Higgins, for instance, I think is very important at the beginning because she shows she has this view on how what I'm talking about, the combination of the structural perspective and really showing what women have done, how difficult it is, because I'll just take out one example, and this focuses the tension between research on historical women composers and feminist criticism, and also postmodern theory. I mean, postmodern theory was crucial for gender theory since the 1970s, and in a way, it became also problematic for really, specifically in music, I think, really estimating women composers, because, and I think it's really nice how she writes it, because in front of all those deconstructive theories of postmodern feminism, it became sort of the sex appeal of looking for women was not really very obvious, and it seemed out-fashioned in a way. But just this seeming to be out-fashioned made that women were again didn't become audible again. But it's a structural problem, I think, because I mean, these deconstructive theories, they, for instance, deconstructed the author in post-structuralism, and the author was deconstructed, whereas women authors have not even been looked upon. And this is a structural problem. And this also shows how difficult it is what you've done. But I think it's really, you really succeeded in doing combining exactly these or facing and succeeding in this challenge. And I go on with the second chapter of Susan, because this is on analysis, and I think this is the other challenge, because the next thing why women composers are made inaudible is that analysis. There were many studies on the social problems why women didn't do this, and this again is making musical women inaudible. But what you show in this chapter, and which is really important, we need different methods to analyze. We can analyze women composers. We cannot, and this is you show this in 4 examples. I'm sure you could have had 20 million examples, but it's fine how you just choose some examples to show different ways on how to analyze and at the same time reflect on contexts and be inventive also in the methods of analyzing. Then I would like to pick out the chapter on of Laura Strass, because what I think is very important in this chapter is also the transcultural perspective. Firstly, it's very nice how the author of this chapter first shows how or reflects on what it means to be a composer, which the status of a composer emerged in European culture during the long 19th century. And at the same time, how it was difficult for women during this time in Europe, at least, to fit with this with all the what was a composer thought to be, just to have a name and to show oneself in the to be self confident, and women should be timid, and these pictures didn't go together. And she shows this, and at the same time, and this is really. At the same time, firstly, she names composers, and she doesn't only name the most important, the most famous one, which is Maddalena Casolana. She does, but she also names the ones who are not that famous. And this is also, I think, something which you see in the whole book, that not sort of repeating what is done in music history, just naming the famous names. And what she does also is, or what I find is outstanding also, is the transcultural perspective, showing that, for instance, in China and India, there were concepts of singing and composing which are similar to the European concept, but at the same time completely different, specifically to the notions of gender. And this is a really very important perspective, I think. The last example I'd like to pick up is this is because I know more about this than about music of the 16th century. It's the chapter on the salon, because I think this is very, very, very good example for showing again how to reflect on structures, social structures, and also combining this with an analytical perspective. Here, the authors say that they try to explore, I think I quote, they explore two different spaces for the expression of female subjectivity in the 19th century: the physical space of cultural practice, salonesque gatherings in private rooms, and the creative space of cultural practice, songs that would have been heard in these gatherings. And doing so, they make the voices of women in these songs audible, and also give another example for analyzing a song within this under this perspective. And I think I'll stop here and because I'm afraid I've already spoken too long.
Thank you so much, Cornelia. Our second speaker, R. Larry Todd, Arts and Sciences professor at Duke University, has also been at the forefront of the study of women in music as both scholar and performer. His books include Fanny Hensel, The Other Mendelssohn, which has transformed our understanding of Hensel's life and work, and his earlier Mendelssohn, A Life in Music, described by the New York Review of Books as, quote, likely to be the standard biography for a long time to come, end quote. He has written widely on topics ranging from Hensel to Clara Schumann, Amy Beach, and Florence Price, among others. A fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation, Todd edits the Composers Across Cultures series for Oxford University Press, and he is currently co-authoring with Katharina Uda a monograph entitled Sounding Riddles, Tales of Ciphers, Sphinxes, and Other Musical Curiosities. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you, Joe. It's a great pleasure to be here and to help celebrate the launch of this important book. Those who have edited or co-edited volumes of essays know exactly how much work goes into it and how long it takes to see something to fruition. So you both are to be congratulated, along with Cambridge University Press, for bringing this out. In the prologue, there is the reference to the first 50 years of research into women composers. And so a quick calculation brings us back to the year 1974. And there are fewer and fewer of us who can remember that year, but there are still some around. And, I was thinking the other day of what the climate was like at that time. And it reminds me, as Paula Higgins has reminded us, of the transience of female artistic fame. Think of it for a moment. In 1974, none of us knew, hardly anybody knew, that Fanny Hensel had composed well over 400 compositions. To the extent we knew her music, we knew her as a composer of songs. We knew this fabled story of her brother Felix absorbing 6 of them into his opus 8 and 9 under his own name. But we had no idea exactly how important composition was to her, even though she was composing largely in a kind of isolation. Her husband was a court painter, and as they described it, their life was a life of double counterpoint. So she would improvise at the piano and compose basically on a daily basis while he sketched and worked on some of his paintings. In a similar way, to the extent we knew Clara Wieck Schumann, we knew her primarily as a pianist. We had an idea that she was a composer. Why? Because she, unlike Fanny, did publish a fair amount of music under her own name. Fanny only at the very end of her life did that and then died, and her 400 odd compositions just fell into oblivion until late in the 20th century. We had no knowledge, or not much knowledge, about Florence Price at that time, that Price had composed symphonies and concertos. To the extent we knew the music of Amy Beach, we thought of her largely as a song composer. Maybe we knew the piano concerto. We did not know her piano quintet that well, which arguably is I would describe it as a kind of luminous rehearing, reinterpretation of the Brahms piano quintet in F minor, which of course in 1974 was a staple of the classical repertoire. And if I may indulge in a brief aside, I remember during my student days, one of my professors was a fairly well-known Wagnerian scholar, and I remember him on the topic of Clara Schumann cavilling about her edition of Robert Schumann's piano music, which she had put out in several volumes. There was no discussion of her own music. There was no discussion of how her music might relate to Robert's, how the two possibly went together, or that they might be in dialogue with one another. Of course, in 1974, this is still before the pioneering work of Nancy Reich and her monograph on Clara Schumann, that was largely unexplored territory. And as to why this professor was railing about the edition by Clara Schumann of Robert's piano music, probably, I'm just guessing here, but it probably had to do with the idea of the urtext. These were the days when the urtext was being privileged above anything else, so that late 19th century editions, which were overloaded, overfreighted with hairpins and crescendi and all this, were, not considered critical or what have you. But that was what the situation was like. I do remember the composer, pianist Joan Panetti, on one of her piano recitals, performing Clara Schumann's 3 preludes and fugues, and which were just not known at all, and how revelatory that was. Now to fast forward to the present, where are we today? So if the prologue talks about the past 50 years, we need now to think about going forward the next 50 years. And I have no doubt that well before the next 50 years, there will be a second and hopefully a third, fourth edition of this Cambridge volume, which conveniently summarizes some fascinating points that with which we should be concerned. One is the idea that ideally we need to move beyond the listing of so-called great women composers to in order to consider the role of women in musical culture writ large. And that's, I think, has already been mentioned. There are other ramifications. A fascinating one I found that is discussed in the book has to do with the validity of period designations. To what extent, when we talk about the music of women composers, is there a, for instance, classical style? Is classicism the right way to label this music? That in turn led me to think, well, what about romanticism? In the 1920s, the philosopher and critic Arthur Lovejoy made the remarkable claim that the word romanticism meant so many different things that it was doubtful whether it was at all a valid term. And it seems to me that all of these isms, do they need to be applied in same measure as we do to music by men composers, or should they be rethought? Now, also considering where we are today, we're on much firmer terra firma than we were just a few decades ago. For instance, we now have the collected diaries of Fanny Hensel. We have a thematic catalog of her music. Much of her music is published. It is being actively performed. There is now a new documentary feature film by Sheila Heyman, the great niece of Fanny Hensel, entitled Fanny, the Other Mendelssohn. This was released by Mercury Studios back in October, and it tells the remarkable story of Fanny Mendelssohn's Easter Sonata, the Ostersonate, which has finally been revalidated as a piece by her, not by Felix. This is after the autograph had basically disappeared for decades. It's now safely in the Pierpont Morgan Library where scholars can see it. And happy to report that any day now, we are mid-July, there will be a new critical edition in 2 volumes of this Easter Sonata coming out from Bärenreiter. One volume of which will include a very nice facsimile of the autograph, which was acquired by Robert Owen Lehman in 2012, and now, as I say, is in the Pierpont Morgan Library. But there's still much to do. Just the other day, I was Zooming with Michael Cooper, who has written a new monograph on Margaret Bonds, which is in production at OUP and will appear in the series Composers Across Cultures. The series succeeds the older series known as Masters of Music, or Masters in Music, which goes back to J.M. Dent at the beginning of the 20th century. Michael was writing me that, even though he's finished the book and it's in the works, he's found evidence that Margaret Bonds may have composed 3 symphonies, all of which are lost. So where will we be in a few years? Will we be talking about those symphonies? Will we be still discovering music that has vanished, that never should have vanished in the first place, but has, and of course needs to be part of the historical record? In order to finish, I thought we might just talk about a couple particular cases that I find intriguing. And I'll go back to Clara Wieck first, and to her piano concerto in A minor, which now is fairly familiar work. There are a number of recordings. The piece gets performed more, and there are editions. There are articles about it. But what an extraordinary piece it is. It dates from 1833, when Clara was 14. It was premiered in Leipzig at the Gewandhaus. The conductor was Felix Mendelssohn. Clara was the soloist. And I mention this because had such a piece been composed by Fanny Hensel, it never would have been premiered at the Gewandhaus with her brother, Felix, conducting the piece. Why? Because of the issues of class. Clara Wieck was, of course, middle class. And as Nancy Reich used to talk or describe, because she was middle class, it was acceptable for her to have a professional career, not only as a pianist, but as a composer. And she could compose and publish music under her name, which she did. Fanny Hensel, part of the Mendelssohn family, upper class family in Berlin. There was no way she could have had a professional career as a pianist. And to the extent she had a professional career as a composer, it was limited really to the last year of her life when she did begin finally to start issuing some of her music under her own name. So Clara in 1833 writes a three-movement concerto. It's a monothematic piece. The thematic materials of all three movements are interrelated. The opening movement is a kind of march-like movement. The internal second movement, which she labels a romanza, is a much more intimate movement that turns more toward the realm of chamber music. Those of you who know the piece may remember that very beautiful scoring whereby the piano is accompanied by a cello solo. And then there is the last movement, which is a sort of rambunctious and very difficult piece to play, rondo. Now, these three movements are connected. Why do I mention that? Because this was in 1833, about 10, 12 years after Weber, Cornelia von Weber had written his Concertstück in four connected movements. So Clara was, to one extent, engaging with this then very popular piece. Because Clara was not trained in orchestration, from what we know, the documentary evidence, we know that Robert helped her with that. And it was performed in the Gewandhaus. Now, interesting thing about this is that this piece, which for so long had fallen into oblivion, was extremely important piece for Robert. And the connections to Robert's own music really were never properly described or discussed really until just a few years ago, and there probably are more connections to make. The first one is that if you think about it, Robert's own piano concerto that he wrote for Clara is in A minor, the very same key. It too has connected movements, and it too, in the slow movement, turns to, and in the development of the first movement, turns to the style of chamber music. It is not hard to see that Robert's concerto is in discourse with Clara's earlier concerto. But there's one other point that I find even more compelling. If you know the slow movement of Clara's concerto, and those of you who don't, you can go to any YouTube, and if you go about 7 minutes in, you'll get to the slow movement and just listen to that, and you probably will hear a resemblance that is really astonishing, and that is the opening, what would become the opening of Robert's Dichterliebe, the great song cycle that he wrote in 1840, the Liedjahr, the year in which he married Clara. It is not literally a quotation. It is certainly strong enough to be more than a vague allusion. It's the same pitch transposition, and when you hear it, probably you will think, "Wow, that's something." But whoever talks about that, whoever talks about this great song cycle of the 19th century being unthinkable without this piano concerto of Clara. And then finally, to finish up, maybe just a few words about Fanny and her situation. 453 compositions, most of which were unknown, unavailable until the late 1990s and going into the 2000s. We did not know, for instance, that she composed a amazing piano cycle dossier on the months of the year. This is a piece that lasts about an hour. It is a piece in the piano repertoire that dwarfs in size anything that her brother ever attempted to write. It is, I like to think of it as a kind of cycle reminiscent of Robert Schumann's bigger cycles. We did not know a few decades ago about the Easter Sonata. And the story behind this is that in 1973, the French pianist Eric Heidsieck, a wonderful pianist, I recommend his recordings of Fauré for any Fauré fans out there. They are just exquisite. He made a recording of this piece, which it was then thought, to the extent anybody knew about it, because it was in private possession, nobody could see it, but it was then thought that it was a new sonata by Felix Mendelssohn, not Fanny Mendelssohn. Why? Because the autograph had F. Mendelssohn on it. F was not spelled out. So Eric Heidsieck recorded this piece, and then it vanished. There was no documentary evidence about it. Those few scholars working in the field of Mendelssohn research were aware that there really were no references in his correspondence or in his catalog to such a thing that he had composed. There was one kind of cryptic reference in which he writes in 1829, after he comes back from his walking tour of Scotland, that to Fanny, that he has played her Easter Sonata on board an American frigate in the harbor at Liverpool. That's all he says about it. And so fast forward to, again, the 2000s, and it took kind of small miracles for Angela Mace, who was then a doctoral student at Duke, writing a dissertation on Fanny and Mendelssohn and Felix Mendelssohn and the question of the Mendelssohnian style. And through, as I say, a series of small miracles, she was able to get in contact with Eric Heidsieck, who was able to get her permission from the owner of the manuscript to see the manuscript if she would come to Paris. Angela did, and she was able quickly to put together a few bits of evidence we had and to confirm that the sonata was in the hand of Fanny, not Felix, and furthermore that it was an Easter sonata. It was a new piano sonata of Fanny. But it took several more years until 2024 for an edition of this piece to come out any day now, and for the autograph to be preserved in the Pierpont Morgan Library. These are remarkable events, and it reminds us, I think, in closing, that when we think of history and historiography, these are concepts that often collide. On the one hand, history wants to be a kind of objective chronicling of deeds, whether they are the great deeds or minor deeds. It's a chronicling of what happened. Historiography, on the other hand, wants to use subjective interpretations of how we interpret those events, and which ones do we choose to highlight, to privilege, which ones do we ignore, which ones go away. These two things are constantly it seems to be in a kind of tension, and pendulums may swing back and forth, but this is the reality of where we are. My hope is that going forward, that we will have a greater understanding of the past, so that we can understand where we are now and where we may be going. And I'll just stop there. I think I've probably gone on too long, but again, my congratulations on this publishing event, and I look forward to referring to it many times in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Larry. And thank you again to all our speakers. You've given us much to think about, not only in terms of reflecting on the past, celebrating this new companion, but also envisaging the future. And to quote Larry, what might the next 50 years have in store for us? At this point, we'd like to invite attendees to share thoughts, reactions, congratulations to the editors and authors in the chat or by coming on screen. And in the meantime, I thought, by way of wrapping up this event, I would share some of the questions that have emerged for me over the course of the presentations this afternoon. And I imagine they're ones that we're all thinking about in our respective work and teaching. And the first is, what does it mean to make women composers visible, to go back to Cornelia's presentation? And how do we do so, particularly against the backdrop of earlier phases of the decentered author, or the death of the author, to quote Roland Barthes? What does it mean to be a composer in transatlantic global contexts? How do we analyze music by women? Is this an opportunity to critique existing frameworks, to expand the range of methods at our disposal, or a combination of the two?